The Solitaire Series, Episode 7, The Three of Clubs, by Troy Lambert. Narrated by Troy Lambert. Electronic dance music thumped from the speakers throughout the club. To Jack, it was nearly deafening, rendering his one good ear nearly useless. But there was a game in the back, one he was interested in. The stakes were high, and, well, until he could get some money built up again, he really didn't want to head back to L.A. He was being followed. There were two distinct tales, one a real pro, probably from Solitaire, but with no orders yet regarding what to do about him. He hadn't come into the club, which meant this was likely not a Solitaire property, and that operatives from the organization were not welcome here. The walk to the back room seemed to take a really long time. Leaning heavily on his cane, Jack simply tried not to get knocked over. His unstable leg and ruined right arm made that difficult, not to mention the fact that his missing eye made it impossible for him to see anything on that side of him without turning his head. Add that to his complete lack of depth perception, combined with the dark room and the fact that he'd left Boris in his hotel. Basically, he was screwed. Laser lights flashed in time with the music. A long bar lined one side of the room, every spot along it occupied by a writhing body, most of them scantily clad. He staggered along beside them, the clearest place on the club floor, but was still often jostled. The second tail had followed him into the club, and that man was not far behind. It was okay. Jack doubted he knew the password to get into the back room, and if he did, that would be fine. He could get a better look at him. The man was an amateur. He was dressed in loud clothing that drew attention, a red top hat and coat, a wine-colored scarf, and some classy black and white Oxfords Jack had spotted when he first noticed the man following him. The man often got too close, and other times Jack lost sight of him completely. He would have intentionally lost him, but he kind of wanted to determine who he was before he did. Solitaire on him was enough, so he didn't need any additional surprises. Truth be told, Jack found the whole thing really annoying. Clearly, he couldn't hide, not with his mangled appearance, something that was also Solitaire's fault. He should technically be free, but someone wasn't playing by the rules. At some point, they would either kill him or want to negotiate some kind of peace. Whoever that second tail was, clearly he had fuck all to do with either of those outcomes. By the time he reached the door to the back room, the hat he had pulled low over his face had nearly been knocked off. His tinted glasses, ones he often wore indoors, sat askew on his half-devastated nose. He made an effort to straighten both, at the same time shooting a glance backward into the club. His tail was easily visible due to the ridiculous hat he wore. He seemed to be having fun, moving with the crowd. His act didn't hide his intention, though. Jack had seen him at his hotel, rushing out to get in his own car as Jack pulled away. Well, he'd have a few hours to himself when Red Hat wasn't able to follow him. Jack was here to play. He turned to the guard. "Password," the man said simply, not even blinking at Jack's looks. "Three of clubs." "Enjoy your evening, sir." The man waved a badge over a sensor, a click sounded, and the door opened. Made of thick steel, obviously a security tactic, the back of the door was also covered with a thick layer of cushioned cloth, as were the walls of the entire room. As the door swung shut, the sounds of the club faded. Jack stopped and reached inside his jack pocket, a conservative gray that did nothing to draw attention to him, and removed the lightly tinted lenses he'd been wearing, replacing them with dark sunglasses. To get the old ones off and the new ones on, he had to remove his hat, revealing his bald head, half covered in black, constantly peeling skin. Both pairs of glasses had a strap carefully adjusted to hold them in place, the only way he could keep them balanced on the half nose in the center of his face. His ruined right eye was briefly visible, and he searched the room for reaction, seeing only one waiter who glanced his way, then quickly averted his gaze. He replaced the hat and studied the room again. There were 12 tables, each with varying levels of buy-in. The cheapest table was closest to him at $500. A serious-looking female dealer sat at that one, carefully watching all the players. As his eyes scanned the back of the room, he saw his target, a high-bid table with a minimum $2,500 buy-in. 2 people sat at that table, each staring at the other carefully. A marvel of humanity, the dealer stood nearly 7 feet tall, giant hands hanging at the end of elongated arms. Each card looked tiny between his thin fingers. In spite of his height, the man seemed impossibly thin. his pants seemingly cinched around his skeletal waist, his vest hanging loosely about a nearly non-existent chest. The foundation of his face was a square chin, and a hawkish nose drew Jack's attention first until he saw the eyes. A vibrant green left one stared through him, but the other was an odd yellow color and seemed to aimlessly roam the room without purpose or target. "Jack," the man said, using his name even though they'd never met. "Norman," he responded, taking the man's name from his name tag. "Welcome. Have a seat." A faint accent, maybe from Northern Europe or Scandinavia, betrayed the man's origin without being overly thick or distorting. Jack studied the table before he sat. Typical casinos used a 6-deck setup at most tables, but this one used 8 in the shoe. It didn't make it impossible for him to win, but it did make it harder. Normally, Jack came prepared to lose, but in this case he needed to replenish his bankroll. That could become a problem for him if this dealer was as experienced as he looked. He'd have to be very careful. A smile spread across the half of his face still capable of that action, and he took a seat on the left of the table, putting his right side closest to the player already sitting in the middle seat. "Your stake, sir?" Norman asked. Jack reached inside his coat and pulled out a stack of bills and set them on the green felt. The dealer took the cash, slid it into a drawer under the table, and replaced it with chips. To his right, and a short distance behind the table, a large man in a suit stood, a white cord dropping from a bud in his ear down under the collar of his bluish coat. His eyes met the lenses of Jack's sunglasses and smiled again. The expression shook the strongest of men. He had used that simple facial action to foil assassins more than once. The guard looked away, finding another visual target on the other side of the room. Contrary to popular opinion, counting cards was not some incredible trick that could only be pulled off by near magicians who could do hardcore math in their sleep. The skill could be taught to the right person, and Jack fit that profile exactly. His scheme worked even better since his accident. His appearances made people want to look away instead of watching him closely. Perfect. Sometimes the best way to keep from being noticed was to be noticed for the wrong reasons. The dealer did not share the security guard's horror. He looked right at Jack, studying his face, perhaps looking for a tell in the mess on the right side, or a hidden tick in the still hole left. Jack studied him back. His square, jutting jaw and lanky arms indicated a disability all his own, and the man must have struggled with his own appearance in the past. Leave it to a freak to recognize and study a freak. For a moment, Jack reconsidered. He wasn't one to back down, but there were other casinos, other tables, and perhaps now would be the time to try one of them. And he might have. Then he saw a flash of red, and a man sat down on the far end of the table. His tail. That crimson top hat and jacket distracted from the otherwise normal appearance of the man who just entered the game. "Mind if I jump in?" he said. "No problem at all, sir," Norman said. "Any objections?" "Not for me," Jack said, as the man in the middle simply shrugged. "The more the merrier." Which was true in a way. It was even easier to win by counting cards with 2 other players at the table. The system he used got easier the more players there were, because that meant more cards on the table. He just had to pay attention to detail and keep a running count in his head. Still, the man in the garish red suit offered a distraction he didn't really want. "I'm Bert," the man said. "Jack." He held out his left hand to shake. He studied Bert's face with his one good eye. Dark skin and a flat nose were flanked by sharp green eyes, and wrinkles at the corners revealed a happy man who smiled a lot. He deduced something. This man was a card counter, too. That complicated things even further. If they both started to win, the house could be officially and understandably more suspicious. Jack wished he had known who, or at least what, Bert was, so he could have set up a split or some kind of agreement ahead of time. Instead, he'd have to rely on the other man's instincts to pick up on what he was doing, and to not spoil it for the both of them. Bert put up his money, and the dealer started the game. The first hand was shit. 6-7, hit, bust with a queen. Not a big deal. Losing the first few hands was always a good way to lull the house. Bert won the next hand, and so did Jack, making him back to even. He noted his running total and determined to lose the next hand. But he didn't. Dealt 2 face cards, he chose to stand. The dealer went bust, and everyone came out ahead. Next, he was dealt a pair of aces, and Bert looked at him over the table as he chose to split the pair, making for another nice gain. Dealt good hand after good hand, he actually had to make some foolish choices to lose from time to time to keep things legit. He went bust on 17 when he should have stood instead. Bert coughed at that, and Jack looked his way. He would have offered a wink had he been capable of that action, but his dark glasses hid his good eye, and removing them, well, a wink with one good eye and what the contraction made the rest of his face do? Jack had tried it in a mirror only once, and recoiled from himself in disgust. The game went on. Jack was comfortably up, and he could see Bert was too. He got ready to call it a good day and move on when from the right he heard a voice say something truly odd. "Hey, 5 of Hearts, I recognize you. Can you come with me, please?" A large man in a suit stood behind Bert, another similarly dressed man not far behind him, watching. Jack studied them carefully, realizing he knew one of the guards. It was his other tail, the one he thought to be from Solitaire. How had he gotten inside? He gazed around the room and spotted 4 other men who seemed to belong and who seemed comfortable with the newcomer. Maybe their security hadn't been following him after all, but had been tailing his tail. Bert stood, gathered his chips, and turned to go with them. Jack stood at the same time. "He's with me," Jack said, "and we're just leaving." "Sir, if you could—" Jack removed his hat first and then his sunglasses, then smiled, an expression he knew people found torturous to witness. "Where he goes, I go," he said. The man looked nervous and glanced at the other security personnel in the room. This clearly wasn't going according to his plan. Without authority to act on his own, he backed down. "Fine," he said, "but don't let me see either of you in here again." Jack huffed, glasses still in his hand. He felt the loose skin on his face wiggle as he did so, and the solitaire man looked away. "I don't think you have the authority to tell me that," Jack said, "but I'm happy to talk with management about it if I need to." The other man looked right and left, but the actual security personnel from the club they were in had disappeared. He paid them to get inside, Jack thought, but he didn't pay them enough to risk the wrath of their boss. He had no proof of his assumptions, but he knew it was true. "Let's go, Bert," he said aloud, replacing the glasses on his face and then his hat, once again hiding his deformity. They both gathered their winnings and headed to cash out. Bert got to the window first, and Jack could feel eyes studying him as they walked. The loud conversations at the tables had stopped. Slowly, they resumed, and he felt the attention drift away from him as the gamblers returned to their games. Jack was glad when Bert collected his cash and simply left the room. He heard the dance music in the club rise and fall as he exited. Jack cashed out next and followed. He probably could have stayed a little longer, even gambled at a lower buy-in table and been fine. But something in his intuition nagged at him, and the only reason he hadn't been killed by the assault that had ruined half his body was listening to that small inner voice. He headed out the door himself, first struck by the sound of the club, then the lights and the smells of pheromones and sweat. He stuck close to the bar, not bothering to change his glasses this time. He felt his way along. The few times someone bumped his right side, he ignored the pain. He hoped Red Hat would already be gone, but something told him Bert would not be far. When he finally made it outside, he found his suspicions to be true. "Where to next?" Bert said from his left. Jack turned to look at him. "I work alone." "Why? We could be good together." "Maybe, but you need to keep a lower profile." "Like you do?" "Touché. Still, I don't work with partners." "I could help you, be the distraction to your—" Bert looked him up and down. "To your straight man?" "I'm not looking for help. They're after both of us, you know." "Who?" "Solitaire. Never hurts to have someone watching your back." "I told you I work alone." "Suit yourself," Bert said. He stepped closer and handed Jack a card. "If you change your mind, give me a call." Jack slipped the card into his pocket with his good left hand. "I doubt it," he said, "but thanks." He turned and walked towards his Thunderbird, just now pulling up with a valet driving. He flopped uncomfortably behind the wheel, tossed his cane into the passenger seat, and headed back to his hotel. Boris would be hungry and anxious, missing him. He drove past Bert, who stood exactly where he'd left him. Thanks for listening to the Solitaire Series, Episode 7, The Three of Clubs, by Troy Lambert. Narrated by Troy Lambert. Next up in the series, The Ace of Clubs.